I never claimed to be perfect. But when a man like Daniel, heir to a family fortune, charming, devoted, says he'll only marry a virgin, what was I supposed to do? Tell the truth and get left behind? I told what I thought was a harmless lie because I wanted into his world, his family, his lifestyle. I thought I'd grow into the role. I thought love would make it all okay, until I told him the truth and watched him turn my dream into a nightmare. Let me be clear about something from the start. I never believed in fairy tales until I met Daniel Harrison Whitmore III. That's his full name, the kind that comes with Roman numerals and trust funds that never run empty. He wasn't just rich, he was old money rich. The kind of wealth that's been passed down through generations, built on railroad money and oil investments and land that's worth more than entire city blocks. I was 25 years old and working 3 jobs just to keep my head above water. Waitressing at an upscale restaurant downtown, bartending on weekends, and cleaning offices at night. My apartment was a studio in the worst part of town, with thin walls and neighbors who fought until 3 in the morning. My biggest luxury was buying name-brand cereal instead of generic. That's why, when the catering company I occasionally worked for got hired for the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala, I jumped at the chance. The money was good, but more than that, it was a window into a world I'd only seen in movies. Women in gowns that cost more than my yearly salary, men in custom-tailored tuxedos discussing business deals worth millions of dollars. I should have stayed in the kitchen, should have done my job and gone home to my little apartment and my little life. But I was curious. During my break, I slipped out to the main ballroom just to see how the other half lived. That's when I saw him. Daniel was standing near the silent auction tables, examining a painting that was probably worth more than everything I'd ever owned combined. He had that effortless elegance that money can't buy. It has to be bred into you over generations. Tall, with dark hair that was perfectly styled but looked natural, wearing a tuxedo that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body. But it wasn't his looks that caught my attention. It was the way he carried himself, like he belonged in this world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers and orchids flown in from Hawaii. Like he'd never once in his life worried about paying rent or choosing between groceries and electricity. I was staring. I knew I was staring, but I couldn't help myself. This man represented everything I'd ever wanted and knew I'd never have. He was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished and perfect, and completely out of reach. That's when he looked up and caught me watching him. Any normal person would have looked away, embarrassed to be caught gawking, but something about his smile made me bold. He didn't look annoyed or uncomfortable. He looked genuinely interested, like he was pleased to have caught my attention. He walked over to me, moving through the crowd, like everyone naturally stepped aside for him, which they did. When he got close enough to speak, I caught a hint of expensive cologne, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He introduced himself simply as Daniel, no mention of trust funds or family estates, asked what I thought of the painting he'd been examining. We talked for maybe 10 minutes about art and charity work, and nothing particularly important. But the way he listened to me, really listened, like my opinions mattered, made me feel like I was someone worth talking to. When I had to get back to work, he asked for my number. Right there, in front of all those society ladies in their designer gowns and inherited jewelry. I wrote it on a napkin with a pen borrowed from a nearby waiter, my hands shaking so badly I could barely form the numbers. I didn't expect him to call. Men like Daniel didn't date women like me, women who worked 3 jobs and bought their formal wear at discount stores. But he did call, the very next day, asking if I'd like to have dinner with him that weekend. Our first date was at a restaurant I'd heard about but never dreamed of actually entering. The kind of place where they don't list prices on the menu, because if you have to ask, you can't afford it. I wore the only nice dress I owned, a simple black number I'd bought on sale 2 years earlier for my cousin's wedding. Daniel arrived in a car that was worth more than most people make in a year. Not flashy, just quietly expensive in the way that whispered rather than shouted about money. He opened doors for me, pulled out my chair, ordered wine that I later learned cost $800 a bottle. But more than the luxury, it was the way he treated me that made me fall for him. He asked about my life, my dreams, my opinions on everything from politics to poetry. He made me feel interesting, important, worthy of his attention. Over the next few months, he slowly introduced me to his world. Private boxes at the opera, weekend trips to his family's house in the Hamptons, charity events where I rubbed shoulders with people I'd only read about in magazines. I bought new clothes with money I couldn't spare, trying to fit in, trying to look like I belonged. His friends were polite but distant. I could tell they were trying to figure out what their golden boy saw in a girl like me. His family was more direct in their assessment. I wasn't quite their type, but Daniel seemed happy, so they'd give me a chance. It was during one of those weekend trips to the Hamptons that he told me about his values. We were walking through his family's estate, and calling it an estate isn't an exaggeration. The main house had 27 rooms, with additional guest houses, stables, gardens that required a full-time staff of 12, and a private beach that stretched for almost a mile. He stopped by the rose garden his mother had planted before her death 10 years earlier. The roses were perfect, tended by gardeners who knew more about horticulture than I knew about anything. He told me how much he missed her, how she'd raised him to believe in traditional values, in saving himself for the right woman. That's when he explained his one non-negotiable requirement. He'd waited 28 years to find someone special enough to marry, someone who'd waited for him too. Purity wasn't just important to him, it was essential. His mother had taught him that intimacy was sacred, something to be shared only between husband and wife. He'd turned down countless women because they didn't meet this standard. He looked at me with such hope, such trust, such complete faith that I was everything he'd been searching for. His hand found mine among the roses, and he told me how rare I was in this modern world, how special, how perfect. That's the moment I should have told him the truth, should have explained that I wasn't what he thought I was, that I'd had relationships before, that his perfect vision of me was built on assumptions rather than facts. Instead, I lied. It wasn't a calculated decision. The words just came out, automatic as breathing. When he asked if I'd ever been intimate with anyone, I looked down at my hands and shook my head. When he smiled and pulled me closer, telling me how much that meant to him, I let him believe it. Standing there in that perfect garden, surrounded by wealth and beauty I'd never imagined, I made the choice that would eventually destroy everything. I chose the lie over the truth because the truth would have meant losing him, and losing him would have meant going back to my 3 jobs and my studio apartment and my small, struggling life. I told myself it was a harmless deception, that it didn't matter what had happened before we met, that once we were married, my past would be irrelevant. Love would conquer all, just like in the movies. The engagement happened 8 months later. Daniel proposed in the same rose garden where I'd first lied to him, with a ring that had been in his family for 4 generations. The diamond was so large it looked fake, but I knew from the way people stared at it that it was very, very real. His family's reaction to our engagement told me everything I needed to know about their opinion of me. His grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, was a woman who could trace her lineage back to the Mayflower and had never let anyone forget it. She examined me like I was a painting she was considering purchasing, looking for flaws, checking for authenticity. But when Daniel told her about my traditional values, about how I'd saved myself for marriage, her entire demeanor changed. She smiled at me for the first time since we'd met, took my hands in her cold, thin ones, and told me how refreshing it was to meet a young woman with morals in this degenerate modern world. His father, Daniel Whitmore II, was equally pleased. He pulled his son aside after dinner, and I heard him say how proud he was, how his mother would have loved me, how rare it was to find a girl with old-fashioned values these days. His sister Caroline, who'd been coolly polite to me for months, suddenly warmed up. She started including me in family events, asking my opinion on wedding plans, treating me like a real member of the family, instead of a temporary inconvenience. The wedding planning began immediately. No expense was spared. The Whitmores didn't do anything halfway. We booked the cathedral where Daniel's parents had married, the same church where Whitmores had been wed for over a century. The guest list swelled to over 400 people, including senators, CEOs, and European royalty that the family had connections with dating back generations. My dress alone cost $47,000, custom made by a designer who'd dressed duchesses and movie stars, with hand-sewn pearls and lace imported from France. When I tried it on for the first time, I barely recognized myself in the mirror. I looked like someone who belonged in this world, someone worthy of the Whitmore name. But as the months passed and the wedding drew closer, the weight of my deception grew heavier. Daniel would talk about our wedding night with such reverence, such excitement about being my first. He'd bought books about how to make the experience special for me, how to be gentle and patient. He spoke about it like it was something sacred, something we'd remember for the rest of our lives. His family made constant comments about my purity. Margaret would tell her friends how wonderful it was that Daniel had found someone unspoiled by modern relationships. Caroline would praise me for saving myself, saying how romantic it was that we'd both be experiencing true intimacy for the first time. The guilt was eating me alive. I started having nightmares about the truth coming out. I'd wake up in cold sweats, imagining Daniel's face when he discovered my deception. I practiced confessions in front of my bathroom mirror, writing and rewriting speeches that never sounded right. I tried to convince myself that it would all work out, that once we were married, the lie wouldn't matter anymore, that our love was strong enough to overcome one small deception about the past, that Daniel was reasonable enough to understand why I'd felt the need to lie. But deep down, I knew better. I'd seen how he talked about women who didn't meet his standards, the disgust in his voice when discussing friends who'd slept around in college, the pride in his own restraint, his own purity. This wasn't just a preference for him. It was a fundamental part of his identity. The bachelor and bachelorette parties were torture. His friends made jokes about finally corrupting their pure friend, about how lucky he was to find someone innocent in this day and age. My friends, the few who knew the truth about my past, kept asking if I was going to tell him. I'd laugh it off, change the subject, pretend everything was fine. The week before the wedding, I almost broke. We were having dinner at his family's main estate, discussing last-minute details with the wedding planner. Margaret was going over the timeline for the reception. Caroline was fussing about flower arrangements, and Daniel was holding my hand under the table, occasionally squeezing it when he caught me looking nervous. He leaned over and whispered how excited he was, how he couldn't wait to start our life together, how perfect everything was going to be. The love in his voice, the complete trust, almost undid me right there. I excused myself to the bathroom and spent 20 minutes staring at my reflection, trying to work up the courage to go back out there and confess everything. I didn't. I walked back into that dining room, smiled at his family, laughed at the wedding planner's jokes, and let them all continue believing I was something I wasn't. The wedding day arrived like a storm I'd been watching approach for months. I woke up in the bridal suite at the family estate, surrounded by bridesmaids and makeup artists and hairstylists. Everyone was excited, bustling around me like I was the center of their universe. The attention should have felt wonderful. Instead, I felt like I was preparing for my own execution. The cathedral was a masterpiece of architecture and flowers. White roses, orchids, and lilies covered every available surface. The altar was decorated with arrangements that cost more than most people's weddings. 400 guests filled the pews, all dressed in their finest clothes, all there to witness what they thought was a perfect love story. As I walked down that endless aisle, my arm linked with my father's, I could see Daniel waiting for me at the altar. He looked so handsome in his morning coat, so proud, so happy. When he saw me, his face lit up with such joy that I almost stumbled. The ceremony was beautiful. We'd written our own vows, and when Daniel spoke about our pure love, about waiting for each other, about the sacred commitment we were making, his voice shook with emotion. When I spoke my vows, carefully crafted to avoid outright lies while maintaining the deception. I could see tears in his eyes. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, Daniel kissed me like I was the most precious thing in the world. The congregation erupted in applause. Rose petals fell from the ceiling, and for a moment, I almost believed that everything would be okay. The photo session afterward felt endless. Pictures with the wedding party, with both families, with various combinations of relatives and friends. Everyone kept telling us how perfect we looked together, how happy, how meant to be. I smiled until my face hurt, played the radiant bride, and tried not to think about what came next. After the photos, we had a brief break before the reception. Daniel and I retreated to the bridal suite to have a quiet moment together as newlyweds. He poured champagne. We toasted our future, and he told me again how much he loved me, how grateful he was that I'd waited for him, how perfect our life together was going to be. That's when I broke. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe it was the stress of the day. Maybe it was the way he kept talking about our perfect beginning when I knew it was built on lies. But suddenly, the words were tumbling out of my mouth before I could stop them. I told him I had something to confess, that I hadn't been entirely honest about my past, that I'd had relationships before, intimate relationships, that he wasn't going to be my first. He was going to be my 20th. The silence that followed felt like the end of the world. I watched his face change, watched the joy and love drain out of his eyes and get replaced by something cold and terrible. His hands, which had been holding mine, started shaking. He dropped them like I'd burned him and stepped backward until he hit the wall. I tried to explain, tried to make it better. I told him that none of those other men had meant anything, that I'd chosen him, that I loved him like I'd never loved anyone. I said that surely what mattered was our future together, not what had happened before we met. I begged him to understand that I'd only lied because I was afraid of losing him. He didn't say a word, just stared at me like he'd never seen me before, like I was a stranger who'd somehow replaced his wife. For a long moment I thought he might forgive me, thought he might be angry but willing to work through it. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room. I followed him, my elaborate dress rustling against the marble floors of the estate, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I called his name, begged him to wait, to let me explain properly. But he kept walking, moving through the halls like he was sleepwalking. I found him in the ballroom, where 400 guests were waiting for us to make our grand entrance as husband and wife. The orchestra was playing, champagne was flowing, everyone was laughing and talking and celebrating what they thought was the beginning of our happily ever after. Daniel walked straight to the microphone on the stage where we were supposed to have our first dance. His voice, when he spoke, was perfectly calm, perfectly controlled, and absolutely devastating. He thanked everyone for coming to share what should have been the happiest day of our lives. He apologized for any inconvenience. He told them there would be no reception, no dinner, no dancing. He asked them all to please go home. The silence that followed was deafening. 400 faces turned to look at me standing in the doorway, in my $47,000 wedding dress, and I felt every single pair of eyes like knives cutting into my skin. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. I saw his grandmother's face in the crowd, cold and disgusted and completely unsurprised, like she'd been waiting for something like this to happen. I saw Caroline covering her mouth with her hands, tears in her eyes. I saw my own parents, confused and embarrassed, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Daniel disappeared somewhere into the depths of the estate before anyone could question him. Security appeared at my elbow like magic, politely but firmly escorting me toward the exit. The last thing I saw as the massive front doors closed behind me was the guests slowly gathering their things and leaving, their faces confused and hungry for gossip. My parents tried to talk to me in the car ride home, tried to understand what had happened. But how do you explain that you've destroyed your own wedding with a lie? How do you tell your family that the fairy tale they'd watched you live for the past year was built on deception? The days that followed were a blur of humiliation and desperate attempts at damage control. I called Daniel's phone every hour until he blocked my number. I sent emails that bounced back undelivered. I wrote letters that were returned unopened. I tried reaching out to his friends, his family, anyone who might listen to my side of the story or convince him to give me another chance. Nothing. It was like I'd never existed at all. The story of our disaster wedding spread through social circles like a disease. Some people took Daniel's side, calling me manipulative and deceitful. Others were more sympathetic but still maintained a careful distance, not wanting to be associated with the drama. Within a month, invitations stopped coming, calls went unreturned, and I found myself essentially alone. My own friends started avoiding me too. The ones who'd known the truth about my past felt guilty for not pushing me to be honest. The ones who hadn't known felt betrayed that I'd lied to them too. Everyone had opinions about what I should have done differently, but no one wanted to actually spend time with the woman who'd destroyed her own fairy tale. The apartment Daniel and I had shared, the penthouse overlooking Central Park, with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that cost more than cars, was no longer mine. His name was on the lease, and his lawyers made it clear that I was no longer welcome there. I had a week to collect my personal belongings before the locks were changed. Walking through those rooms one last time, seeing the traces of the life we'd built together, was like attending my own funeral. The engagement photos on the mantelpiece, the wedding dress hanging in the closet, the thank you notes we'd started writing for gifts we'd never keep. It all felt like artifacts from someone else's life. I found myself back where I started, except worse. The studio apartment I rented with what little money I had left was in an even worse neighborhood than before. The walls were thin, the neighbors were loud, and every night I could hear sirens and shouting and the constant reminder that I'd fallen from grace. I tried to rebuild, got a job waiting tables at a different restaurant, one where I was unlikely to run into anyone from Daniel's world. Attempted to make new friends among my co-workers, people who didn't know about my spectacular failure. Told myself I was better off without someone so rigid and judgmental, someone who couldn't see past one mistake to the love we'd shared. But every night, I'd find myself scrolling through social media, looking for glimpses of the world I'd lost. Daniel had made all his accounts private, but his family and friends hadn't been so careful. I could see pieces of their lives, charity galas, family vacations, the kind of effortless luxury I'd briefly been part of. 3 months after the wedding that wasn't, I saw a photo that stopped my heart. Daniel at some family event, smiling for the camera. But he wasn't alone. There was a woman next to him, blonde and elegant and wearing pearls that probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years. She looked like she belonged in that world in a way I never had, even when I was trying my hardest to fit in. The comments on the photo were telling. Friends of the family welcoming her warmly, saying how wonderful it was to see Daniel happy again, how perfect she seemed for him. I recognized some of the names, people who'd once said the same things about me before they learned who I really was. 6 months later came the announcement that shattered what was left of my heart. Daniel was engaged again, to Victoria Elizabeth Hartford, a woman whose name alone told you everything you needed to know about her pedigree. The engagement photo was perfect. She was wearing what looked like a simple white dress, but I could tell from the cut and fabric that it probably cost more than I'd make in 6 months. He was looking at her the same way he used to look at me, like she was something precious and rare. But this time, he wasn't being lied to. I spent hours studying that photo, memorizing every detail. They looked so happy together, so perfectly matched. She had the kind of effortless elegance that comes from being born into the right family, raised with the right values, educated at the right schools. She was everything Daniel had thought I was, everything I'd pretended to be. The wedding announcement in the society pages was everything mine should have been. A tasteful photo, a guest list that read like a who's who of American high society, venues that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. But more than the luxury, what struck me was how right it all looked, how natural and unforced and genuine. I didn't go to work the day of their wedding. Instead, I sat in my tiny apartment with its thin walls and distant sirens and constant reminders of how far I'd fallen, scrolling through social media for any glimpse of what should have been my life. The photos that eventually appeared were breathtaking. Victoria looked like a princess in her wedding dress, radiant and elegant and completely at ease. Daniel looked happier than I'd ever seen him, even during our best moments together. Their families beamed with genuine joy, celebrating a union that made sense to everyone involved. But what hurt the most wasn't the luxury or the happiness or even the obvious rightness of their match. It was realizing that somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten what I was really mourning. I hadn't just lost Daniel, though losing him felt like having my heart carved out with a dull knife. I hadn't just lost the wealth and status and beautiful life, though going back to struggling for every dollar was harder than I'd remembered. I hadn't just lost his family's acceptance and the social connections that came with being a Whitmore. I'd lost myself.